the seduction that brought down God's giant. Imagine having such an extraordinary force that no one can defeat you. Now think about losing everything because of a single choice. This is the story of Samson, the strongest man in the Bible, whose mission was to free Israel from Philistine oppression. However, even with superhuman power, he had a deadly weakness: his heart. Throughout this video, we will dive into the ups and downs of Samson's life, from its miraculous birth to its dramatic fall, betrayed by Delilah. Find out how his strength came from the covenant with God, how he defeated 1,000 soldiers with a donkey chin, and how his history teaches powerful lessons about faithfulness, choices, and redemption. Get ready for an intense action, betrayal, and a last act of revenge that shook the enemies of Israel. But beware, this story is not just about Samson. It has everything to do with the choices we make in life. Are you ready? Since childhood, Samson was already different. His superhuman force was not any talent, but a sign of his covenant with God. Like Nazi, he had a clear purpose: free Israel from Philistine oppression. His name became synonymous with invincibility, for no army or warrior could face him. However, his true battle was not against enemies in the field of war, but against their own weaknesses. Samson's strength did not come from the muscles, but from the presence of the Spirit of the Lord upon him. Whenever he was challenged, something supernatural happened and he became unstoppable. He defeated a lion with his own hands and later faced 1,000 Philistine soldiers with just one donkey jaw. But as powerful as it was, its history reminds us that even the strongest may fall when they ignore the signs of danger. Samson's mission was clear: to rid Israel from the oppression of his enemies. However, he did not always take this responsibility seriously. Its strength could overthrow any barrier, but its impulsiveness often put it in risky situations. He was a hero, yes, but also an ordinary man, subject to the temptations and challenges we all face. And that's right, that your biggest fight started. Israel lived dark times. The Philistines, a warrior and cruel people, had imposed a heavy domain over the Israelites. Abusive taxes, destruction of plantations, and constant oppression were part of everyday life. The people cried out for liberation, but without a strong and brave leader, hope seemed distant. It was in this scenario that Samson came with a special call to face this yoke and change the story. The Philistines not only dominated militarily, but also tried to impose their culture and beliefs on Israel. They were famous for their idolatry and practices contrary to God's commandments. The chosen people began to move away from their identity, and the need for a liberator became increasingly urgent. Samson was not just a warrior, he was God's answer to the cry of a people who suffered. But here comes an important point: the force of Samson alone would not be enough. He would need to trust God and act wisely to fulfill his mission. However, his impulsivity led him to act without measuring the consequences. The oppression of the Philistines was real, but the biggest battle of Samson was yet to come, and it would not be only against external enemies. Samson's arrival in the world was once a sign that God had a special plan for him. His sterile mother was visited by an angel who announced a miraculous birth. But there was one condition: the boy should be a Nazi, separated from the womb to fulfill a sacred mission. Since before he was born, Samson was already carrying a grand destination, but also a great responsibility. Being Nazi meant living under specific rules. I could not touch anything unclean, drink wine, or cut the hair. These external signs symbolized their consecration to God. Her hair, which would later become a central element of her history, was a visible symbol of this covenant. But as we will see, covenant is not just about appearance, it is about true commitment to God. From an early age, Samson must have heard from his parents about his special call. He was not an ordinary man, there was a greater purpose for your life. However, as with many of us, having a divine call has not prevented him from making wrong decisions. Its story teaches us that having a great destination is not enough, we need to live according to it. Samson did not take long to demonstrate that his strength was not common. Still young, he faced a fierce lion and tore him with his own hands without any weapon. This feat was not only impressive, but also a sign of the power of the Lord's Spirit upon him. Later, Samson would return to the scene and find a swarm of bees inside the lion housing, creating a puzzle that would confuse his enemies. His strength continued to surprise. In a striking episode, Samson was surrounded by 1,000 Philistine soldiers. Any other man would be condemned, but he, armed only from a donkey jaw, defeated all. This event showed that its strength was not training or strategy, but of the divine power that acted through it. However, even with such capacity, Samson often underestimated the dangers that surrounded him. Each of these victories showed that God was with him, but also revealed a worrying pattern: his impulsiveness. Instead of using his strength wisely, Samson often acted by instinct without thinking about the consequences. And when someone does not recognize the limits of their own strength, sooner or later, faces challenges that go beyond the physical. Despite his huge strength, Samson had a weakness that made him vulnerable: his emotions. He was an impulsive man, guided by desire and passions, without measuring the consequences of his choices. From an early age, he showed a tendency to get involved with women who did not share their faith, which would eventually become their ruin. His weakness was not in his muscles but in his heart. Samson's story teaches us that it is not enough to be physically strong if we are not emotionally strong. He could defeat 1,000 soldiers with a donkey jaw, but could not overcome his own inclinations. Her involvement with Delilah was the greatest example of this. Even knowing the danger, he could not resist manipulation and was carried away by his emotions, ignoring the clear signs of betrayal. How many times do we not fall into the same traps? Often, our greatest defeats do not come from external enemies, but from thoughtless choices. Samson shows us that true strength is in self-control. If we do not learn to dominate our emotions, we may end up like him, a giant knocked down not by the sword, but for his own weaknesses. Delilah entered the life of Samson as a Gael, seductive, engaging and dangerous. The Philistine leaders sought it out with an irresistible proposal, discovering the secret of Samson's strength in exchange for a great reward. Moved by ambition, she accepted the mission and started her emotional manipulation game. Like a spider weaving her web, she surrounded Samson with sweet words, but treacherous intentions. Samson, blinded by passion, did not notice the signs. Delilah repeatedly insisted that he would reveal his secret, and with every lie he told, she tested to see if it was true. Instead of suspecting, he played the danger, thinking he would never be defeated. But no one overcomes an enemy that underestimates. And Delilah, with his insistence and emotional blackmail, managed to make the strongest warrior in history to surrender without lifting a sword. This episode teaches us that the greatest threat does not always come from the declared enemies. Sometimes it comes disguised as love. Delilah represents the temptations and distractions that make us lower our guard. Like Samson, we can lose what God gave us when we ignore the alerts and let ourselves be carried out by relationships that move away from our purpose. After so many invested, Delilah finally got what she wanted. With tears and mewling words, he pressed Samson until he revealed his secret. His strength came from the covenant with God, symbolized by his untouched hair. The moment he shared this truth, his luck was sealed. Delilah made him sleep on his lap and had his braids cut, breaking the pact that made him invincible. When Samson woke up, he thought he could get rid of the Philistines as always. But something was different. He did not realize that the Spirit of the Lord had moved away from him. Its strength did not come from the muscles but of the divine presence. Without God, he was just an ordinary man. His pride and recklessness had taken him straight into the hands of his enemies, who captured him effortlessly. Samson's fall is a powerful warning. We often think we can deal with everything alone, but when we neglect our connection with God, we become vulnerable. He lost his strength not because his hair was cut, but because he broke his covenant with the Lord. Its story shows that even the strongest fall when they move away from the true source of their power. The Philistines wasted no time. As soon as they realized that Samson was defenseless, captured him and subjected him to a cruel punishment, they ripped his eyes and turned him into a prisoner. The man who was once feared by his strength was now blind and chained, reduced to a slave. The one who had defeated 1,000 soldiers now turned a mill, doing the work of an animal. But the humiliation did not stop there. The Philistines wanted to display their victory to all the people. They organized a great party in the temple of Dagon, their god, to celebrate the defeat of Samson. He was taken to be ridiculed, mocked, and exposed as a war trophy. The enemies who once trembled before him now laugh without fear. It was the bottom of the well to the one who had already been the strongest man in Israel. The scene of blind and humiliated Samson teaches us something deep. The consequences of our choices can be harsh. He played with the danger and paid a high price. However, the story was not over yet. Even in the midst of shame and failure, something was about to happen, one last act that would change everything. Samson was blind, chained, and humiliated. But something began to happen in silence. Her hair grew again. This was not just a physical detail, but a symbol that your connection with God could be restored. In the midst of his pain and shame, he finally recognized his total dependence on the Lord. Samson did not ask for revenge for pride, but cried God for a last chance to fulfill his mission. At the height of the Philistine feast, Samson was taken to the temple of Dagon, where thousands of enemies were gathered to mock him. With his hands in the temple columns, he made his last prayer. He asked God to return his strength to overthrow that place and destroy those who had imprisoned him. And at that moment the Spirit of the Lord came upon him once again, giving him an even greater strength than before. With a supreme effort, Samson pushed the temple columns and the whole structure collapsed, killing thousands of Philistines, including their leaders. He also died there, but ironically his greatest victory came at the time of his death. He who had failed so many times found redemption in his last act, proving that even after painful falls we can still fulfill our purpose. After the fall of Samson, the story of Delilah disappears from the scriptures. The woman who was a key piece in the betrayal of Israel's judge simply disappears from the biblical account. What happened to her? Did you receive the promised reward and lived in luxury, or was your name marked by the shame of being complicit in the fall of a chosen God? The Bible does not give us this answer, leaving a mystery in the air. What we can reflect, however, is the fate of those who choose to betray others by ambition. Delilah may have achieved momentary riches, but did you live in peace? The betrayal has consequences, and often what looks like a victory can become a trap. Delilah's name was marked in history as a symbol of deception and manipulation, and that, by itself, is already a sentence. This absence of information invites us to think, what do we want to leave as a legacy? Delilah had an opportunity to be part of something grand, but chose the opposite side. Unlike Samson, who found redemption in the end, his story does not give us clues to regret or change. In the end, it disappears from the pages of history, and perhaps that was its true punishment. The story of Samson and Delilah goes far beyond an ancient narrative. She teaches us deep lessons about strength, weakness, choices, and redemption. Samson had everything to be a great leader, but allowed his emotions to move him away from his purpose. However, even after falling, he found a way back to God. This shows us that, regardless of our mistakes, there is always a chance to start over. And you? Have you ever been through moments when you felt that you lost your strength? Have you made decisions that have brought difficult consequences? Samson's life warns us to the importance of taking care of our alliances and not underestimating the influences around us. But it also gives us hope. As long as there is one last breath, we can still get up and fulfill our call. If this content spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications for more reflections like this. Leave your comment telling you what impacted you most on the story of Samson and Delilah. And remember, true strength is not only in physical, but in faithfulness to God and the wisdom of our choices.